Imagine being given a way out and still not taking it. You know what you should do. You know the first step. You want the result, but you don't move. You stare at the screen, check your phone, tell yourself you'll start in 10 minutes. Then 10 minutes becomes an hour, and eventually you stop fighting. Most people call that laziness, a lack of discipline, weakness. But there's a stranger possibility. What if your brain isn't asking whether you want to act? What if it's asking, will acting actually change anything? Because when the brain repeatedly learns that the answer is no, something very different from motivation can happen. You can still care. You can still want the outcome. You can even know exactly what to do. And yet, your brain may stop expecting action to matter. Scientists discovered a version of this decades ago, and what they found was disturbing. Two animals could experience essentially the same stressful event, same kind of stress, similar intensity, but there was one crucial difference. One could make it stop, the other couldn't. Later, both were placed in a situation where escape was possible. And now came the strange part. The animal that had previously experienced control was much more likely to act. The other could escape, but often didn't. It had a way out. It simply behaved as though there wasn't one. That observation became famous as learned helplessness. But later research forced scientists to rethink what was actually being learned. Maybe the brain doesn't first learn, I am helpless. Maybe uncontrollable stress pushes the brain toward passivity, while experiences of control teach it something else. My actions can change what happens next. And that distinction changes the entire story, because your brain is constantly collecting evidence. I act, something changes. I act again, something changes again. Or I act, nothing changes. I try again, still nothing. Eventually, the brain has to make a prediction. Is there any point in trying? And once that prediction becomes strong enough, doing nothing can start to feel strangely logical. Not because you don't care, not because you're weak, but because your brain is trying to predict the outcome before you spend more energy. And this is where the biology gets fascinating. Deep in the brainstem is a region called the dorsal raphe nucleus, or DRN. It's involved in serotonin signaling and in regulating responses to stressful events. In animal studies, uncontrollable stress can strongly activate this system, and when that response isn't regulated by a sense of control, animals can become less likely to initiate escape behavior. But this does not mean serotonin is a give-up chemical, and the DRN is not a literal shutdown button. The brain doesn't contain one tiny switch labeled give up. The reality is more interesting. Under uncontrollable stress, brain systems involved in threat and action can shift toward a state where repeatedly attempting an action predicted to fail becomes less likely. In other words, sometimes the brain isn't asking, how do I win? It's asking, is there any point in trying? And if the answer keeps coming back as no, the brain can begin treating inaction as the safer prediction. That's the unsettling part. The brain can turn yesterday's experience into tomorrow's expectation. But here's where the story changes, because control doesn't just affect what you do. It can change how your brain responds to stress in the first place. Regions of the medial and ventral medial prefrontal cortex are involved in processing control and regulating responses to stressful events. Think of the brain asking, do I actually have a lever here? If the answer is yes, the experience of stress can be processed differently. And this gives us the central idea behind the entire story. Your brain does not need you to control everything. It needs evidence that something you do can change something that happens. Nobody controls everything. You can't control the economy. You can't control what another person thinks. You can't control the past. You can't control every outcome, but you can sometimes control the next move. And that tiny distinction can be enormous, because the brain doesn't need a map of the entire future. It needs to know, is there a lever I can still pull? And now the story becomes uncomfortably relevant to modern life. Your brain is surrounded by things you cannot control: the news, global crises, the economy, algorithms, other people's opinions, the future, what strangers think about you, what happened yesterday. And your phone can deliver thousands of these problems directly into your attention before you've even started your day. You can watch a crisis happening thousands of miles away, compare yourself with millions of people, argue with strangers, refresh the news, refresh again, and spend hours reacting to things you could never directly change. But here's the strange part. The problem may not simply be too much information. It may be stress without agency. You can react, you can comment, you can refresh, but the world doesn't move because you refreshed the page. At the same time, modern convenience can remove some of the small moments of friction that create immediate cause and effect experiences. You act, something happens, you adapt, you try again. We should be careful here. This does not mean technology has literally atrophied your control circuit. The science doesn't justify a claim that simple. But there is a more interesting possibility. Your brain may be receiving enormous amounts of information about things it cannot control, while getting fewer opportunities to repeatedly experience small, controllable challenges. And your brain learns from repetition. So ask yourself, what exactly are you practicing? Because you may be teaching your brain the wrong lesson without realizing it. You call it protecting my peace, and sometimes that's exactly what it is. Rest matters. Boundaries matter. Walking away from genuinely harmful situations can be healthy. The problem begins when avoiding discomfort becomes your default response to anything difficult. You don't have the conversation. You don't start the project. You don't make the phone call. You don't go to the interview. You don't ask the question, because avoiding it makes you feel better immediately, and your brain gets a very clean lesson. Discomfort appeared. I escaped. The discomfort disappeared. The escape worked, at least for the next 5 minutes. And that's why the pattern is so powerful. The immediate relief rewards the avoidance, but the hidden lesson is more expensive. When something feels difficult, leaving is how I make it stop. Do that often enough, and avoidance can become increasingly attractive. Not because you're weak, because your brain is learning from the consequences. Then there's the fairness contract. Someone hurts you, they lie, they betray you, they treat you unfairly, and you decide, I can't move forward until they admit what they did. It sounds reasonable, but look at what just happened. Your next step now depends on their next action.
They may never apologize. They may never understand. They may never admit they were wrong. And while you're waiting for them to change, your brain is still waiting for permission to move forward. You don't have to call what happened fair. You don't have to forgive someone. You don't have to forget it. But you can stop making your next step dependent on their next move. Because the moment someone else controls the condition for your recovery, they control the clock. And that's another way of giving away agency. And this one may be the most dangerous. An event becomes an identity. Your business fails. You say, I'm a failure. You fail an exam. I'm stupid. Someone rejects you. Nobody wants me. Notice what happened. A temporary event became a permanent prediction. And now the next attempt doesn't just carry the possibility of failure. It threatens your sense of self. The question is no longer, can I solve this? It becomes, what will this say about me? And that's a much heavier question. Because if failure proves something terrible about who you are, then avoiding the attempt becomes a way to protect the identity. You don't just avoid the problem, you avoid the possibility of discovering that your worst belief about yourself might be true. And now we can see what connects all three traps. Avoidance says escape works. The fairness contract says my future depends on someone else. Identity fusion says one outcome defines me. Different behaviors, same underlying lesson. My actions don't matter. So how do you teach the brain something different? Not by shouting "try harder," not by pretending everything will be okay, and not by becoming fearless. You change the evidence. Because if the brain learns from what happens after you act, then give it a different experiment. When everything feels overwhelming, don't ask, "How do I fix my life?" That's too big. Ask, "What is the smallest thing here that responds to me?" Make the bed. Wash one dish. Answer one email. Open the document. Take a 10-minute walk. Do the first 5 minutes. The point isn't the task. You're running an experiment. I acted, something changed. That's a tiny experience of control, and that's the signal your brain needs. Not "I control everything," but "my behavior can still change something." Then do it again and again. Because resilience isn't built from one enormous victory. It's built from repeated evidence. Don't wait for life to teach you resilience through a crisis. Choose small challenges you can control. Have the uncomfortable conversation. Finish the workout when you'd rather stop. Put the phone away. Learn something difficult. Do the task you've been avoiding. The goal isn't suffering. The goal is the sequence: challenge, action, outcome, adaptation. You're giving your brain a different kind of training data. Not everything is easy, but difficulty does not automatically mean helplessness. You're teaching your brain that discomfort can exist without automatically requiring escape. And this is where another misconception about resilience falls apart. Mental strength is often portrayed as becoming harder. Never break, never complain, never stop. But rigid objects can be strong right up until the moment they snap. Real resilience is closer to flexibility. Sometimes you push, sometimes you rest, sometimes you confront, sometimes you walk away, sometimes you change the plan, sometimes you accept that something is simply outside your control. The goal isn't to use the same response against every problem. It's to recognize, what does this situation actually require? Because sometimes resilience means fighting, and sometimes resilience means letting go. The strength is not in always pushing, it's in knowing when to change your response. Now imagine your identity as a building. Imagine the entire building is resting on one pillar: your career, your relationship, your appearance, your business, your grades, whatever matters most to you. If that single pillar collapses, the whole structure shakes. But if your life contains several meaningful pillars: relationships, health, skills, creativity, work, curiosity, values, then losing one can hurt without becoming the collapse of everything. You don't need every part of your life to be perfect. You need your entire sense of self to not depend on one thing going right. Because resilience isn't about becoming impossible to hurt. It's about making sure one hit doesn't define the entire structure. And now we can return to the question we started with. Why do sometimes we shut down under pressure? Not because the brain is simply broken, not because you're automatically lazy, not because you lack discipline, and not because strong people never struggle. Sometimes your brain is making a prediction based on the evidence it has collected. Trying won't change anything. And if that prediction has been reinforced long enough, even a way out can become difficult to see. But the same principle that created the prediction gives us a way forward. You don't have to convince yourself that you control the world. You don't have to become fearless. You don't have to fix your entire life tomorrow.
You need something smaller. When everything feels out of control, can you still find one place where your actions matter? One lever, one decision, one conversation, one step, one thing that responds when you move. Because the most resilient person isn't necessarily the one who feels the least fear, or experiences the least stress, or never shuts down. It's the person who can eventually find the path back to, I can do something here. And maybe that's the real difference between helplessness and resilience. Not whether life hurts you, not whether you ever fall apart, but after the noise settles down, can you still find the smallest thing that responds to your hand? Because your brain doesn't need proof that you control the world. It needs proof that your actions still matter. And sometimes that's enough to start moving again. Everything has a reason.